Have you ever woken from a nightmare with your heart racing, the kind of dream that leaves an imprint so vivid it follows you into the waking world? For me, Elias Venner, an audio engineer who spent a lifetime chasing forgotten sounds and buried echoes, this nightmare wasn't just a fleeting vision. It was a gateway, a door I never meant to open. This is the story of the silent scream, a terror that began in the dark recesses of my mind, but soon spilled into my reality. The first time it happened, I thought it was just another restless night. The dream started innocently enough, a dimly lit theater, its grandeur faded but still imposing. Dust motes floated through the stale air, illuminated by a single, flickering chandelier. The silence was oppressive, so complete that it pressed against my ears like a physical weight. As I stepped forward, the floor beneath me creaked, the sound unnaturally loud, almost as if the building were protesting my presence. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe, and the sensation of being watched crawled over my skin like icy fingers. I tried to speak, to call out and shatter the silence, but my voice was gone, stolen, locked away in some unreachable void. My throat burned as if I had been screaming for hours, but no sound escaped. Panic clawed at me, my chest tightening as I realized the silence wasn't natural. It was alive. It throbbed, it pulsed, and in its depths something waited. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, like the faint rustle of leaves, they grew louder, more insistent, until they surrounded me. Words in no language I recognized, their cadence hypnotic, their meaning dripping with malice. I turned frantically, searching for the source, and that's when I saw it, a shadow moving against the far wall. It wasn't cast by the dim light. It was independent, writhing like a living thing. I froze, unable to look away as the shadow stretched and grew, taking shape. A figure emerged, tall and featureless, its body shrouded in a darkness so deep it seemed to devour the faint light around it. My legs refused to move, rooted to the spot by a terror so profound it felt like my very soul was screaming. The figure raised an arm, pointing at me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me, cold and merciless. A single word echoed in the silence, reverberating in my skull: chosen. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, low, guttural, and laced with an otherworldly resonance that made my bones ache. As it spoke, the walls of the theater began to shift, twisting and warping as if the building itself was alive. The chandelier shattered, plunging everything into darkness, and in that moment, I felt it, a presence closing in, suffocating me. And then I woke up. My body was drenched in sweat, my breath ragged, my throat raw as if I had been screaming for hours. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. Yet, the silence felt wrong, unnatural, as if the dream hadn't entirely released its grip on me. This was only the beginning. What I didn't know then was that the silent scream wasn't just a nightmare, it was an invitation. And it was about to consume every part of my life. Before we delve deeper into this chilling tale, I need to ask, have you ever felt the shadows creeping closer in the night, as if something was watching, waiting? If so, this channel is for you. Subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles, where we confront the unexplainable, and don't forget to ring the bell icon. But remember, once you open this door, there's no going back. It began on a night like any other, the kind of night where the ordinary disguises the extraordinary lurking just beneath the surface. Sleep overtook me swiftly, but what I entered wasn't rest. It was the beginning of something far darker. In the dream, I stood outside an enormous theater I had never seen before. Its facade was aged, its once majestic stonework now cracked and crumbling. The marquee above was shattered, with only faint remnants of letters that seemed to spell a warning I couldn't decipher. The air around me was thick and stagnant, carrying the faint scent of burnt wood and something metallic, like rust or blood. The entrance beckoned, and despite every instinct screaming to turn away, I stepped inside. The lobby was vast but cloaked in shadow, its ornate details hidden beneath decades of neglect. A faint, flickering light pulsed at the far end of the room, just enough to illuminate the scattered remnants of what once must have been luxurious furnishings. I moved closer, the sound of my footsteps muffled as if the space itself sought to swallow all noise. The silence was crushing, broken only by a faint sound, like the scratching of nails against wood, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. As I ventured deeper, the details of the theater grew more unsettling. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries depicting haunting, almost grotesque figures mid-scream. Their faces, twisted in agony, seemed to follow me, their eyes shifting slightly each time I looked away. The floor beneath me wasn't smooth. It was uneven, sticky, as if something had been spilled there long ago and never cleaned. Then I noticed the air had changed. It was heavier now, saturated with a cloying, damp smell that made my stomach churn. And there it was, the sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew clearer, closer, the faint hum of a single note. It vibrated through the air, low and mournful, like the first chord of a funeral dirge. I couldn't pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from every direction, vibrating deep in my bones. My breath hitched as I turned a corner and came upon the grand auditorium. Rows of decayed seats stretched endlessly before me, each one covered in a thick layer of dust. The stage at the far end was shrouded in darkness, save for a single spotlight that illuminated something strange. At first, I thought it was a figure standing there, but as I moved closer, I realized it was a mannequin, dressed in a tattered costume that might have once been elegant. Its painted eyes stared blankly forward, but as I stepped closer, I could have sworn its head shifted slightly to follow me. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the cavernous space until it was joined by a faint whisper, barely audible but undeniably there. I couldn't make out the words, but they carried a sinister rhythm, like a chant from an ancient ritual. My heart pounded in my chest as the whispers merged into a single voice, soft but laced with menace. It spoke my name, Elias. I froze. My name echoed through the silent hall, and the mannequin on the stage began to twitch, its limbs jerking unnaturally. My legs felt like lead, but my curiosity, or perhaps the pull of something darker, compelled me forward. I climbed the stairs to the stage, each step creaking ominously beneath my weight. Standing before the mannequin, I noticed its painted face had changed. The hollow eyes now gazed directly into mine, and the corners of its mouth had twisted into an unsettling grin. In its outstretched hand was a small, tattered piece of paper, and against my better judgment, I took it. The moment my fingers brushed the paper, the stage lights flared to life, illuminating the entire theater in a harsh, unnatural glow. Suddenly, the seats weren't empty anymore. They were filled with figures, shadows shaped like people, motionless but staring directly at me. My scream was trapped in my throat, strangled by the overwhelming silence. That's when the note in my hand began to burn, forcing me to drop it. As it fell, the shadows in the audience began to rise, their forms shifting and twisting as they surged toward the stage. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I turned desperately to the mannequin, only to find that it had vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of scorched fabric. The whispers grew louder, their words incomprehensible, but filled with malice. I felt a hand, cold and skeletal, grip my shoulder from behind. And then I woke up. My room was dark, the air cold, and the silence eerily similar to the one in the theater. My throat was raw, as if I had been screaming, though I couldn't recall making a sound. The faint hum from the dream still resonated in my ears, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. What I didn't know then was that this dream wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was a warning, a door I had opened to something far more terrifying than I could comprehend. And whatever I had brought back with me wasn't finished yet. The next time I found myself in the dream, it was as if I had never left. The decaying theater loomed around me, but now, everything felt sharper, more real. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier, and the faint hum from before had grown louder, an ever-present vibration that crawled under my skin. I stood in the middle of the auditorium, staring at the stage. The mannequin was gone, but its presence lingered, a sinister reminder that something unnatural was at work here. As I stepped forward, the floor beneath me seemed to shift, the boards creaking like a warning. I reached the stage again, but this time, something was different. The dust that had coated every surface was gone, replaced by faint footprints leading toward the left wing of the stage. The prints were small, as though made by a child, yet something about them felt deeply wrong. They seemed to glow faintly, a sickly, pale light that pulsed with every beat of my racing heart. I followed the footprints, drawn by a force I couldn't resist, even as every nerve in my body screamed for me to stop. The whispers had returned, louder now, their tone urgent and angry. They seemed to grow in number, overlapping until they became a chorus of distorted voices, all speaking in unison. My name, Elias, echoed again, sharper and more pronounced, cutting through the cacophony like a blade. The footprints led me to a door I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind the stage. It was old and warped, the wood splintered and cracked, as though it had been struck repeatedly by something heavy. Scratched into the surface was the same sigil I had seen in my first dream, a twisted, spiraling symbol that seemed to move slightly when I stared at it for too long. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the metal icy cold under my touch. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow hallway, its walls lined with cracked mirrors. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and wrong. The images in the mirrors didn't move in sync with me. Instead, they lingered a moment longer, their eyes following me as I stepped inside. The whispers grew louder here, bouncing off the walls until they became a deafening roar. Halfway down the hall, I noticed something out of place, a single chair, positioned at an odd angle. It was covered in fresh, crimson stains, the metallic tang of blood filling the air. On the chair sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, its spools spinning slowly despite there being no power source. My curiosity overpowered my fear, and I pressed the play button. At first, there was only static, a grating noise that made my ears ache. Then came the voice, a chilling, disembodied whisper that spoke directly to me. It repeated the word chosen over and over, each time growing louder, more insistent. Beneath the voice, another sound emerged, a faint scream, muffled and distant, as if it were trapped on the other side of a wall. It sent shivers down my spine, the sheer agony in the sound making my skin crawl. Suddenly, the mirrors around me began to crack, one by one. Each shattering pane revealed something behind it, shadows that moved and writhed, clawing at the fractured glass as if trying to escape. The hallway felt like it was closing in on me, the walls shifting and bending unnaturally. As the last mirror shattered, the tape recorder stopped abruptly, the silence more suffocating than the noise had been. I turned to flee, but the hallway was no longer empty. At the far end, the shadowed figure from before emerged, its form impossibly tall and its presence overwhelming. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat burned, my chest ached, and tears streamed down my face as I fought to make a noise. Any noise, but the silence was absolute. The figure reached for me, its hands stretching unnaturally long, its fingers ending in jagged, razor-like points. And then, everything stopped. I woke up again in my bed, gasping for air. My throat was raw, my body trembling, and the faint scent of blood lingered in the air. On my bedside table sat the tape recorder from the dream, its spools still spinning slowly. This was no longer just a dream. The silent scream was reaching into my reality, and I knew that the nightmare had only just begun. The dream began again, but this time it was different. The theater was no longer a decaying ruin, it was alive. The chandeliers above glowed with an otherworldly light, casting sharp, unnatural shadows that danced along the walls. The seats, once empty and dusty, were now occupied. Silhouettes filled every row, unmoving and eerily silent. Though I couldn't see their faces, I felt their eyes on me, unrelenting and heavy. The faint hum that had haunted me before was now a deep, resonant vibration, a sound that seemed to burrow into my bones and take root. I stood on the stage, frozen, as the air grew colder, thickening like an invisible fog. My breath came out in shallow gasps, visible in the icy air. Then I noticed something, or rather, someone, standing at the far end of the stage. It was a figure, their back turned to me, dressed in a tattered gown that seemed to sway as if caught in an unseen wind. The figure didn't move, but the silence between us felt suffocating, charged with a tension that made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. My body felt as if it were anchored to the stage, held in place by some unseen force. Slowly, the figure began to turn, and as it did, the whispers returned, louder, more chaotic, overlapping until they became an unintelligible roar. My hands flew to my ears, but it was useless. The sound wasn't external, it was inside me, growing louder with every passing second. When the figure finally faced me, I wished I hadn't looked. Its face was a void, a gaping darkness where features should have been. Yet, in that emptiness, I felt something staring back at me, something ancient and malevolent. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at me, and the whispers abruptly stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence. Then it spoke. The voice was unlike anything I had ever heard, deep, guttural, and layered with an otherworldly echo. It didn't use words, but I understood its meaning clearly. You cannot escape. As the voice echoed through the theater, the air seemed to ripple, and the entire room began to shift. The walls bent and twisted, the ceiling stretched impossibly high, and the stage beneath my feet groaned as if it were alive. The silhouettes in the audience began to rise, one by one. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as though they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. They turned toward me in unison, their hollow faces tilting as if studying me. A low, mournful wail began to emanate from them, a sound that grew louder and more agonized with every passing moment. It wasn't a scream, it was the absence of one, a sound so deeply wrong that it felt like the world itself was unraveling. Suddenly, the figure on the stage stepped toward me. Each movement it made caused the air to grow colder, the light to dim, and the silence to press harder against my ears. I tried to scream, but just like before, no sound came out. My throat felt like it was closing, the pressure building until it felt like I might burst. Desperation drove me to act. My eyes darted around the stage, searching for something, anything, that could help me. That's when I saw it. A small, ornate box sitting near the edge of the stage, its surface etched with the same spiraling sigil that had haunted me since the first dream. Without thinking, I lunged for it, my hands trembling as I grabbed it. The moment my fingers touched the box, the room erupted into chaos. The silhouettes in the audience began to convulse violently, their wails merging into a deafening crescendo. The figure on the stage lunged toward me, its movements impossibly fast, its form stretching and distorting as it reached for the box. I opened the lid, and a blinding light burst forth, consuming everything around me. The light was accompanied by a sound, a piercing, high-pitched scream that wasn't mine, but felt as though it were coming from inside me. The figure let out a guttural roar, its shadowy form disintegrating in the light. The silhouettes in the audience froze, their bodies collapsing into ash as the theater began to crumble. Just as the walls gave way and the stage beneath me splintered, I woke up. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air. My hands were shaking, my throat raw, and my ears were ringing with the faint echo of that scream. On my bedside table, the small, ornate box sat quietly, its lid closed. I reached for it, but the moment my fingers touched the surface, the sigil began to glow faintly, and a single word echoed in my mind: chosen. The nightmare wasn't over. It had followed me into the waking world, and I knew that whatever force I had encountered wasn't finished with me. The dream refused to let go. Even in the waking hours, its tendrils wrapped around my thoughts, tightening their grip. The box sat on my bedside table, its faintly glowing sigil pulsating softly in the dim light of my room. I couldn't bear to touch it again, yet I couldn't look away. Something about it felt alive, as if it were waiting for me to unlock whatever horrors it concealed. But the box wasn't the only thing left behind. Over the following days, the hum I had heard in the theater began to bleed into reality. It was faint at first, a low vibration I dismissed as background noise. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. It would grow louder at night, a relentless thrum that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I swore I could hear whispers beneath the hum, fragmented voices that carried no discernible words but sent chills racing down my spine. Desperate for answers, I decided to investigate. I began searching online, typing vague but ominous phrases: theater dream recurring, haunted sigil, silent scream. At first, the results were scattered, a mix of urban legends and forgotten lore. But one article caught my eye. It described an abandoned theater in a nearby town, eerily similar to the one in my dream. The photos showed a crumbling facade, its marquee missing letters, and a hauntingly familiar symbol etched into its stone. My blood ran cold as I stared at the image. This wasn't just a coincidence. The theater in the article was real, and it bore the same sigil as the box. The accompanying text detailed a string of mysterious events: patrons who vanished without a trace, performers who left the stage mid-performance only to be found days later, their faces frozen in expressions of silent terror. The most chilling detail was the legend of the silent scream, a curse said to consume anyone who dared disturb the theater's restless spirit. I dug deeper, piecing together fragments of its history. The theater had been built in the early 1900s and was once a hub of opulence and grandeur. But its decline began after a tragic fire during a performance. Witness accounts spoke of screams that were never heard, only felt, a deafening silence that left survivors haunted for the rest of their lives. The fire claimed dozens of lives, including the lead actress, who was said to have been performing a climactic scene involving a scream when the flames engulfed the stage. The deeper I delved, the more connections I uncovered. Old photographs of the theater revealed something I hadn't expected: a familiar face among the patrons. My great-grandfather, a man I knew only from faded family photos, was pictured in one of the last documented events at the theater. He was seated in the front row, his eyes fixed on the stage. The caption beneath the photo was chilling: final performance before the fire. The revelation hit me like a cold wave. Could this connection to my family explain why I had been drawn into the nightmare? Was I the next link in a chain of torment stretching back generations? My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Unable to resist the pull of the truth, I began reaching out to locals in the town where the theater was located. Most were reluctant to talk, their voices laced with unease whenever the subject came up. But one man, an elderly historian, agreed to meet with me. When I mentioned the sigil in my dreams, his face grew pale. "The mark you describe," he said, his voice trembling, "is the seal of the voiceless. It's said to bind souls to silence, trapping their screams in an eternal void. Those who bear the mark are chosen to carry the curse forward." He paused, his eyes dark with dread. "If you've seen it, you must stay away from the theater. To return there would be to invite something far worse." Despite his warning, I couldn't stop myself. Something compelled me to keep digging. Late one night, as I sifted through archived newspapers, I found a cryptic note scribbled in the margin of an old article. It read, "The box opens the door. The scream is the key." My heart pounded as the pieces began to fall into place. The box, the dream, the hum, they were all connected. The box wasn't just an artifact, it was a gateway, and the scream I could never release was the price of opening it. The more I learned, the more reality began to blur. Shadows in my home seemed darker, stretching unnaturally across walls. The hum now followed me everywhere, a constant reminder that the nightmare had breached the barriers of my waking world. And the whispers, they grew louder, more distinct, their fragmented words forming a message I couldn't yet decipher. I wasn't dreaming anymore. Whatever I had unleashed was real, and it was coming for me. I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The theater wasn't just a place in my dreams, it was real, and I had to face it. Against every shred of logic, I decided to go there. The drive was agonizing, the weight of dread pressing down on me with every mile. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to change, growing heavier, colder, and thick with an unplaceable tension. By the time I arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of twilight to illuminate the desolate streets. The theater stood at the end of a narrow road, its once grand entrance now a rotting husk of broken wood and shattered glass. The marquee above hung precariously, the remaining letters spelling a fragmented warning, "Silent." My heart pounded as I stepped out of the car, the hum in my ears now a low, menacing growl. The moment I crossed the threshold, it felt as if the world had shifted. The air inside was colder than it should have been, carrying the sharp tang of smoke and decay. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, its beam trembling as if the shadows were resisting its intrusion. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, but here and there, I saw the sigil carved deep into the plaster, the grooves dark as though filled with ash. Each step I took echoed unnaturally, the sound twisting and reverberating as if the space itself were alive. As I moved deeper, I felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes on me, a presence that seemed to breathe in sync with my own ragged breaths. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood. It was coming from the far end of the lobby, where the door to the main auditorium loomed. I pushed the door open, and the sight before me stole the air from my lungs. The rows of seats were still there, but they were covered in thick cobwebs, the faint outlines of figures visible beneath the layers of dust and decay. They were frozen, their shapes slumped unnaturally, as if caught in the throes of some unseen agony. As I stepped closer to the stage, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man, hunched and gaunt, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide, darting around the room as if searching for something unseen. He froze when he saw me, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his words trembling with fear. "It doesn't let you leave once you've stepped inside." I recognized him instantly from my research, Harold, the historian I had spoken to. He had warned me to stay away, but now here he was, trapped in the very nightmare he had feared. Harold gestured frantically toward the stage, his voice rising in desperation. "It's the box. It needs the scream. If you opened it, you've already let it in." Before I could respond, the auditorium shuddered. The hum that had haunted me for days grew into a deafening roar, and the shadows around us began to move. The slumped figures in the seats began to stir, their heads turning slowly to face us. One by one they rose, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were blank voids, but I felt their focus, their malice, as they turned toward me. Harold grabbed my arm, his grip icy cold. "Run," he shouted, his voice breaking. "It feeds on fear, on silence. Don't let it take your scream." We bolted toward the stage, but the shadows were faster. They surged toward us, a tide of darkness that swallowed everything in its path. As I reached the edge of the stage, I felt the temperature plummet, and a voice, deep and guttural, echoed through the space. Chosen. The lights above flickered wildly, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls. In the chaos, I spotted something glinting on the stage floor, the box. Its sigil glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the deafening hum. Harold hesitated, his face pale and stricken with terror. "You have to seal it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But the cost, you'll never be free." I didn't have time to ask what he meant. The shadows closed in, their forms stretching and twisting, reaching for me with clawed hands. My chest tightened as the oppressive silence returned, stealing the air from my lungs. My scream was trapped again, clawing at my throat, desperate to escape. With every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged for the box. The moment my fingers touched it, a blinding light erupted from the sigil, and the auditorium was consumed by a deafening explosion of sound. The shadows recoiled, their forms disintegrating in the light, but not before one of them reached Harold. I watched in horror as he was pulled into the darkness, his scream swallowed before it even began. And then, everything went still. The theater was silent again, the oppressive presence gone. I stood alone on the stage, the box in my hands. But something was wrong. The sigil on the box now glowed brighter, and I felt it. Something inside me had changed. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I realized the hum was still there, faint but persistent. The box was quiet, but its presence was heavy in my hands. I knew this wasn't over. Whatever I had faced inside that theater hadn't been defeated. It had just begun to follow me. And now, the real nightmare was only just beginning. The drive home was a blur, the weight of what I had experienced crushing down on me like a vice. The box sat on the passenger seat, silent but ominous, its sigil pulsing faintly as though it had a heartbeat of its own. The hum in my ears never left, a low vibration that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. Every shadow on the road felt alive, twisting unnaturally in the faint glow of my headlights. By the time I reached my house, the air felt thick, heavy, as if I had brought the theater's oppressive presence back with me. I placed the box on my desk, staring at it as if it might spring to life at any moment. The sigil glowed faintly, its light casting eerie patterns on the walls. My thoughts were a whirlwind of terror and confusion. Harold's final words haunted me. "You'll never be free." What had I unleashed? And why had the box chosen me? That night, sleep was impossible. The hum grew louder, resonating through the walls, the floors, even the very air I breathed. Then came the whispers. They were no longer faint or fragmented. Now they spoke in unison, their words chillingly clear. "The scream is the key." My heart pounded as I realized they were coming from the box. Its sigil pulsed faster, its glow brightening with every whispered phrase. Driven by equal parts fear and desperation, I opened the box again. Inside, I found an object I hadn't noticed before, a small, weathered journal. Its leather cover was cracked and stained, the sigil etched into its surface. Trembling, I opened it. The pages were filled with frantic scrawls, diagrams, and entries written in a hand that grew shakier with each passing line. One phrase appeared over and over, scratched into the paper as if by someone in a state of sheer panic. "It feeds on silence." Flipping through the pages, I found a section that described a ritual, something the previous owner had attempted to banish the entity bound to the box. The instructions were cryptic, the words barely legible, but one thing was clear: the ritual had failed. The final entry was a single sentence, written in large, jagged letters: "Do not let it take your scream." Before I could process what I was reading, the lights in the room flickered. The temperature plummeted, and my breath became visible in the frigid air. The hum crescendoed into a deafening roar, and the shadows around me began to move, twisting and coalescing into a singular, towering form. It was the figure from the theater, its void-like face now inches from mine. The air around it seemed to ripple, a suffocating presence that made every instinct in my body scream to run, but I couldn't move. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with their chilling chant: "Chosen. Chosen. Chosen." The figure raised a hand, and with a flick of its long, skeletal fingers, the journal flew from my grasp. It opened on the floor, its pages flipping wildly before settling on a diagram of the sigil. The figure bent down, its eyeless face hovering over the book, and when it straightened, I felt a new, unbearable weight pressing on my chest. The room began to shift. The walls stretched and twisted, the floorboards groaning beneath me. I was no longer in my house. I was back in the theater. The stage loomed before me, and in the center of it stood the box, its glow now blinding. Around it were the shadowy silhouettes of the audience, their hollow faces turned toward me. They began to scream, silent, agonizing screams that filled the air with a suffocating pressure. The figure appeared behind me, its skeletal hand gripping my shoulder. It leaned in, its guttural voice reverberating through my skull. "You will complete the cycle." In that moment, I understood. The box wasn't just a gateway, it was a prison, and the entity needed me to unlock it fully. The scream wasn't mine, it belonged to the countless souls trapped inside. The sigil was their binding, and breaking it would release them, and whatever else was waiting on the other side. Desperate, I turned to the box, its glow pulsing in sync with the screams. I knew what I had to do. I reached for it, my hand trembling as I touched the lid. The moment I opened it, the shadows surged toward me, their forms writhing and twisting as they were pulled into the light. The figure let out a guttural roar, its grip tightening painfully before it too was dragged into the box. The theater began to collapse, the walls crumbling into darkness. I screamed, my voice finally breaking free, and the sound echoed endlessly as the light consumed everything. When I woke, I was in my room, the box sitting quietly on my desk. The sigil no longer glowed, but the hum remained, faint and constant. I wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted unnaturally, and I felt the unmistakable weight of unseen eyes. The box had chosen me, and now I was its keeper. The nightmare wasn't over, it had only just begun. I woke up gasping for air, my chest heaving, the echo of my screams still ringing in my ears. The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and lingered, refusing to fade. The box sat on my desk, silent and still, but its presence was heavier than ever. The sigil no longer glowed, but it seemed etched deeper into the surface, as if it had absorbed something in the chaos. For a moment, I thought it was over. The shadows no longer moved, the hum had faded to a faint vibration, and the whispers were gone. But the silence, it was different now. It wasn't the oppressive void I had felt before, but a fragile, expectant stillness, like the air before a thunderstorm. It was waiting. I sat up, my hands trembling as I reached for the box. The moment my fingers touched it, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, the faint hum returning, this time layered with a faint, distorted melody. I opened the lid, expecting to see the void or the blinding light that had consumed the theater. Instead, there was only darkness, an endless, pulsing void that seemed to draw me in. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a faint distortion in the air. But as I stared into the darkness, the figure emerged once again. Its void-like face was no longer distant. It was right there, staring back at me from within the box. Its form was more defined now, more human, but its presence was just as malevolent. It raised a skeletal hand, its jagged fingers pointing directly at me, and its voice, deep and guttural, echoed in my mind. The cycle continues. I slammed the lid shut, my heart pounding, but the hum didn't stop. The sigil on the box glowed faintly again, and I realized the truth. The box wasn't just a vessel. It was alive, a bridge between worlds, and I was now its keeper. Whatever I had sealed inside wasn't gone. It was watching, waiting, and it wasn't alone. Over the next few days, the signs began to appear. At first, they were subtle, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a faint echo of whispers in the dead of night. But soon, they became undeniable. The sigil began appearing in unexpected places. On the bathroom mirror, etched into the frost on my car window, even in the grain of the wooden floorboards. Each time I saw it, the air grew colder, the hum louder, and the shadows darker. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the dreams returned, more vivid and terrifying than ever. The theater loomed in every corner of my mind, the shadows reaching for me, the whispers growing louder. The figures in the audience, their hollow faces fixed on me, began to follow me into my waking life. I would see them in reflections, in the windows of passing cars, in the darkened corners of empty rooms. One night, as I sat alone, trying to piece together what had happened, I heard a noise, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the box. I froze, the air around me growing icy cold. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped abruptly. The lid of the box began to creak open, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, the figure from the theater, standing in the shadows, its void-like face inches from mine. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze pierce through me, cold and unrelenting. Then, in the silence, its voice echoed once more. You cannot escape. The door has been opened. Before I could react, the box snapped shut, and the figure vanished. The hum stopped, the air lightened, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But as I turned back to the box, I saw the sigil glowing brighter than ever, and the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. And now, as I share this with you, I have to ask, what happens next? The sigil has started to appear outside my home, in the park, on random street signs, even in the clouds. Wherever I go, it follows, a constant reminder that the nightmare isn't over. And I can't help but wonder, if you've made it this far, has it started following you too? Take a look around. Do you see the sigil? Do you hear the hum? If you felt the shadows creeping closer, you might already be part of this story. Leave your theories in the comments. What do you think the sigil means? Why was I chosen? And most importantly, what would you do if you were me? If you want to explore more of these chilling tales, don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles. Every like, every comment, every new subscriber fuels our journey into the unknown. But beware, once you open the door to the darkness, there's no turning back. And remember, the silent scream never truly fades, it just waits for the next voice to claim. See you in the next nightmare, if you dare to return.